both serve dual purposes in monitoring the chat and facilitating the session as a whole. As we mentioned in the flyer for this session, we wanted to show and sample the app Pear Deck to go ahead and facilitate some interaction here as we talk about evaluated rubrics today. To join our Pear Deck session, please go direct your phone or your web browser to the address displayed in the top bar, joinpd.com. And you can join using it'll ask you for its code, and that code is pictured down below, IWZFU. Just a few moments to go ahead and join us. I see about half of us there. So I'll wait the other half of us to get there, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone just joining. I'm going to drop some directions for what we're doing here in the moment in the chat in just a second here, so you can join with us. Okay, we have everyone, or most everyone with us, most everyone in the room. For those of you still working on it, I will move forward, but as long as you've got that join code, it'll let you into the session here in just a moment, and that code will be displayed throughout our presentation here. So we'll go ahead and start and explore a little bit about how Pear Deck works, some shameless advertising. We'll talk more about Pear Deck on Friday. That's the way some of the votes have gone so far. And so if you want to know more about this experience a little bit later on, how to facilitate it for your students, we're happy to show you a little bit more on Friday as one of the 2 apps that people have chosen to showcase. We'll go ahead and get started here. We are talking today about refining rubrics for distance learning, and we have 2 ICANNs we want to attend to. We first want to identify a rationale for employing rubrics to assess student performance on certain occasions. And we also want to identify key principles of designing effective rubrics throughout. Our ground rules are that we'll begin and end on time. So here we are beginning roughly at 3 o'clock. For those of you still joining, again, that join code is projected up here in the upper right-hand corner, IWZFU at joinpd.com. Please stay focused and be respectful as we continue in our conversations here today. And please, as always, assume positive intent as we communicate our truths and our experiences to our colleagues from around the country. Please use the chat feature for questions and responses. As I said at the outset, I am flying solo today, so I will do my best to keep up with that. If I miss you, it's not because I'm ignoring you, it's because chat tends to move faster than I can read and present at the same time. So I will be very intentional about pausing for a few times and asking you to unmute and verbalize any questions then as well. But I just want to be upfront with that I might be a little bit slower to respond just because I'm pulling double duty here today. And please do mute your microphones when you're not speaking, as you are all doing at the moment. For those of you joining us for the first time today, we do encourage back channel conversation, so please do keep ideas flowing in the chat. Even if I'm not directly paying attention to it at the moment, I will come back around to it and look for some questions and ideas going back forward. But that conversation, as you've seen in the past, is a powerful learning tool, so please keep using that. I will try to find those questions again as I can throughout our session. We'll have a formal Q&A toward the end. And certainly I will go back through the chat, and if there's anything I've missed, I will follow up with you individually as well. And just for full disclosure, the chat will be safe to allow us to follow up, especially in this case, and to allow us to compile some additional resources that you contribute and share for your later distribution in our follow-up message. So we'll start first with our welcome and warm up, and here is your first chance to interact with Pear Deck, and we'll have a few extra minutes here because this is our first use of that. So the question is this: many of us are grading on a plat, whatever verbiage your state of locality happens to be using at the moment. What are some of the criteria we are using to determine whether a student passes a course or grade? As you see on the bottom right-hand corner, depending on your app, there should be a submit response or response button. Some of you have already found that you can go ahead and input responses using that button. I'll give you just a few moments, and I can see your responses by teacher dashboard, and I'll look for a few of you to respond here, and I will see what threads come out of that in just a moment. I'm seeing many of us have started a response. A lot of us are in the finishing pages or finishing stages of putting a period in our sentence or so on and so forth. And we'll talk about some of those responses here in just a moment. So one neat thing Pear Deck allows us to do is to make some of these answers public. Of course, they're anonymous to you're in this view, but I can go ahead and display some of these thoughts to everyone here. So some of the things that you're saying is you're looking for answering questions completely, whether students are with you in the digital learning or not, if they're participating at all, if they're meeting their own goals, if they're and a lot of us are really more showing evidence and a lot of thinking that participation right now is our main concern. And certainly that jives with a lot of the guidance we've seen with states and locales as they put it out. The stark reality is, though, that next school year, whatever that might look like, we're going to be doing more distance learning, and it's going to transition more from crisis learning and crisis educating to this is the way education or this is the way learning looks now, at least for the time being. So we're very much seeing this as sort of a dress rehearsal, and one of the rationales we have for bringing the session forward and what session why now is to get our feet wet in refining rubrics here in this context where the stakes are a little bit lower before we have to think more critically about how we're determining grades in the fall, because in the fall will have to be more than just participation, and whether or not they're on board with us, and just having a pulse, so to speak. So we wanted to join into the discussion from that frame. So we'll do a little work to build that rationale, and then we'll talk about some common things to pay attention to when looking at rubrics, and then we'll have a little bit of a large PLC meeting and explore some rubrics here together. So the rationale for rubrics, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, we know that content-based items like select a response or fill in the blank are easily marked right or wrong. A lot of us might be using apps like Socrative or Kahoot or so on and so forth to help us in that easy right or wrong. Computers are really good at that stuff and filling out whether or not I've got the right word here or I've ticked the right box. Computers, while they're getting better, aren't quite as good at looking at process-based items like rubrics or performance tasks. And those are really tough to say you got it right or wrong. So the rubric helps to make that measurement more objective and more meaningful. So that's what we're looking at when we're talking about rubrics. When we have these process-based things like a flip grid or like an essay or like making some sort of presentation, having that rubric and those guidelines on hand clearly communicates expectations, makes it more objective. Less of a, well, he or she likes me as a student, and more of a, it's their what the expectations were. So we'll talk some about different kinds of rubrics today, and this is, for many of you, I know a refresher, but it helps to frame what we want to zero in on today as part of our discussion. We know that rubrics are broad in nature. They come in two flavors, holistic or analytic. We also know that there are task-specific rubrics that are more narrow. Generic rubrics are better suited for a skill like problem solving or evidence-based reasoning. Task-specific rubrics, as the name implies, are more narrowly tailored for specific tasks, like a specific essay or a specific argument or a specific piece of art that you're actually going to create. And in both cases, they come in those two different flavors of holistic and analytic. Holistic rubrics work to assess performance on the whole. So they look at parts of the rubric and say, that's a 4, that's a 3, but doesn't necessarily give you feedback on the individual components. Analytic rubrics can again be either broad or narrow. They can be generic or task specific, but they do help us to identify more specific areas of strength and areas of growth, which ties in really nicely with some of our discussions on feedback that we've had earlier. Makes that thinking, makes both those strengths and those areas to pay attention to really crystal clear for both us and the student. And so that area is where we're going to spend a lot of our time today. Whether you're thinking about a broad rubric that's generic to problem solving or videos in general, narrow task specific rubric, we're going to be thinking about the analytic flavor of either of those. Pardon me, to really spur our thinking as we go forward. So we'll stop here with another text-driven response. And the question is, what are some learning ed targets for which you have used analytic rubrics in the past? So again, you'll see a prompt either on your phone or on your computer screen. In the bottom of that screen, it will ask you to start authoring a response. Please go ahead and drop some thinking there, and we'll move forward from there. For those of you that have just joined, I've dropped some directions for what we're doing here in the chat. So please take a look at those. I'm looking at a lot of you who are authoring responses here. Give you a few moments to finish those up before we look at some of the common threads in there. Okay, we'll go ahead and throw some of those answers up here on the screen for us all so we can all benefit from the thinking that we're doing here. So some of us are talking about essays or paragraph responses. Some of us are talking about them presentations, especially focusing on vocabulary. That's this very specific dimension of that presentation we're paying attention to. Looking at science fair projects, looking at how well we understand tests or quizzes, looking at individual concepts in ELA. We're looking at, again, very clearly defining the areas of presentation here, and some more specific examples of tasks that you have all put together here. So thank you for sharing some of that thinking. Just as a preview of what will happen next because of this is normally a lot of these ideas would go into chat. What Pear Deck will allow me to do as presenter here is file a lot of your responses and push them out to you in one big old happy file, and I will go ahead and always do and summarize those to the best we can. You'll be able to get a good record of a lot of thinking that you're sharing here. With that said, I do want to take a moment just to check on the chat and see if there are any questions, comments, or concerns that people are having before we move forward. So we're seeing some additional conversation report projects and oral presentations that people have used as well. So thank you for sharing in the chat. I will go, like I said, I'll come back and forth and check in on the chat throughout the presentation, and as well as make space for some questions and answers where we can. So as we're thinking these places where we're designing analytic rubrics, there's a lot to be said about analytic rubrics, and for that reason, we title this session "Refining Our Knowledge, Refining Our Implementation of Rubrics," because we know that as educators who have been in the field for either 1 year or 100 years, you've been exposed to rubrics in some way, shape, or form, and we don't necessarily need to spend the time building some of that foundational knowledge. Where we do want to spend some time, though, is thinking about what it takes to re-examine some of our rubrics to make sure they most effectively communicate our expectations to students, as well as some best practices that we can use as some talking points for examining those rubrics. I want to be very clear in defining a few terms that we'll use throughout the presentation. This terminology is common throughout the field, but particularly the rubric for rubrics we're referring to today was published by the Educational Testing Service, who is a giant in the standardized testing world. But they also have a lot of helpful things to say about instruction as well. And this is one particular protocol and rubric that we have found particularly useful in bringing to our partner site. The term we'll use today is criterion. And that is a dimension of quality that's useful to consider on its own. And more clearly illustrate that in just a moment. But there's those big ideas that we're grading the rubrics, we're grading student performance on. The indicators are the subheads we look for under each criterion, and we'll make that more clear in just a moment. And levels are those points on the rating scale. So they're the 1, 2, 3, 4, or need support to advanced. However we choose to label the top of our rubric, that's what we mean by levels here. So the first criterion that we refer to when we're talking about rubrics is coverage and organization. And there's 3 indicators that speak to coverage and organization of a rubric. The first one is 1A, that it covers the right content. And when we're talking about rubrics that cover the right content, we of course want to be able to draw a direct relationship from our rubrics to the relevant standards. If I am developing a rubric for an essay and it's talking about citing textual evidence, I should probably make sure I'm copying some of that evidence or some of that language, or at least using the language to inspire the rubric directly from that Common Core or state standard as appropriate, right? To make sure that our rubrics represent the knowledge and performance level our students will be expected to perform at. We also want to make sure that the rubric covers only what's essential feature of the quality product. It may break some of our ELA teachers' hearts to hear this, but if, for example, I'm asking in a studies class I'm asking some of the students to develop an essay that shows some argumentative reasoning, I might not be as concerned about their writing conventions in that case. But I really want to know, be able to track the flow of their argument from their thesis all the way to their claims and so forth. That's not to say that writing conventions have no in those rubrics, but in order to give the best and most accurate reporting about the student's proficiency in that area, we want to make sure that that rubric is tied directly to what is assessed in that content area. So for that reason, we want to leave out some trivial features. And again, trivial meaning not necessarily important, not necessarily crucial to mastery in this particular content area. Again, not to minimize the importance of conventions, but saying that there are places where it makes sense to look for that, and places where it makes a little bit less sense to look and grade harshly for those more sorts of things. The second criteria we want to talk about, or second indicator we want to discuss, is that our criteria are well organized. So we want to make sure when we have those criteria, they're concise and usable. As we just review the criteria, the indicators and the criteria displayed along the top, coverage and organization being the first criteria, that tells us exactly what it is that we're looking for at the rubric. We want to know how well the rubric covers what it's supposed to cover, and if it's organized in a way that's usable for readers. So we want to make sure that we're using simple language to convey that expectation to students, and as well as make our expectations clear. We also want to group similar features into those criteria. So when we talk about coverage and organization, all 3 of those indicators, like does it cover the right content, it's well organized, and the number of levels, all fit into how the rubric is built. So as we look at that last column, we want to make sure we have the number of levels that is appropriate for our learning target. In many cases, that is a 1 through 4 scale, or a need 4 to achieve proficiency all the way to advanced proficient, or whatever your state or locality chooses to phrase that. Some of you are in a case where you're looking at either pass or incomplete in this particular environment that you're working in. And that is certainly one way that we can structure rubrics. We could say, yes, you're proficient, or no, you're not, and work with those two levels of performance. But I would encourage you and push you to think a little bit beyond that, right? Because this is likely going to be our reality for next year, this remote learning, depending on where you're at. It's possible that we can work smarter, a little bit harder, and only have one rubric that still has those 0 through 4, those 1 through 4 levels of performance, but designate 3 and above as passing and below 3 as proficient. That way you've put in the work once, you've put together a quality rubric, but don't necessarily have to redo that next time you come back to that task or next time you come back to that skill next year in virtual learning. So for now, when we have some of the time and space and that luxury to, it's a great time to experiment with that. That said, we also want to make sure the number of levels is appropriate for the use case. There are some cases where a 0 to 4 doesn't make sense for every specific indicator or every specific criteria we have. Sometimes either, especially when I'm looking at for conventions, you either used English, the conventions of standard written English well, or you did not. That's either a meet quotations or not, right? Throughout the rubric, go explore and throughout rubrics, that number can vary, and the number of levels that's appropriate for that use can vary by indicator and sometimes by criterion. The second criterion we want to take a look at is clarity. Does a rubric communicate what we think it communicates to our students? There are 2 indicators we'll take a look at here. First, we want to make sure those levels of quality are defined well. Is it distinct what's a 1, 2, 3, or 4? And we also want to make sure those levels are parallel. So when we're looking at that first indicator that our levels are defined well, first we want to make sure each level, that 4, 3, 2, 1, clearly describes those features that are strong, medium, or weak. Pardon me. And how useful the rubric is to both us and students for assessing the quality of work is so critically dependent on that clarity. We want to make sure that we are saying that in order to be proficient, you need to have these ingredients here. And if you don't have these ingredients, you're something else. You're approaching proficient or not quite there yet, or whatever verbiage your district has chosen to incorporate. We also want to make sure that those levels on the rubric, those levels of quality on the rubric are parallel. So if, for example, we're talking about a violinist and in music class, I don't know if we have any music educators on the call with us here today. But if one of the things that makes their performance bad, so to speak, is lackadaisical bowing, and they're kind of lazy in how they're maneuvering their bow, then if that's something that makes better bowing, should also make the performance better. So at the proficient level, we'd say they'd have evidence of proficient bowing. At the advanced level, whatever better than proficient, in plucking that or bowing your violin strings would work there. If we're talking about citing textual evidence, if proficient is citing evidence that matches that, less than or approaching proficient would be you're citing evidence, but maybe you haven't quite cited that. You haven't used in-text citations properly, or you have not used the best evidence best suited to support your case. So we want to make sure that those descriptors are parallel across all 4 levels, or all 3 levels, or all 2 levels of that rubric. So what that ends up looking like in practical purposes is this. We have our 2 criterion, coverage and organization, and clarity. We have several indicators mentioned that it covers the right content, criteria are well organized, the number of levels fits targets in use, as well as that those levels are defined well and they're parallel. In many conversations, the educational testing service does provide a 1 through 4 rubric rather to talk about each of these dimensions, but we've often find that a lot of educators get bogged in some of that conversation. It doesn't really push that conversation forward because we spend more time looking at the rubric than we do making some assessments of the work that we're doing here in general. So as we've worked with partners, we found a sometimes more efficient use of time is to ask simply educators to agree or disagree with some of these statements. Does the rubric cover the right content? Yes, it does, or no, it does. And to provide a rationale for doing so. And so certainly, as we engage and work with our and partners in PLCs, we can have some conversations around that. Yes, I agree that rubric covers the right content, and here's the evidence I have to support that. But I disagree that it's well organized, and here are some suggestions we can, you might consider to refine that rubric. And those are the conversations we find have been really helpful to educators in refining their rubrics here. So I want you to take a moment to think about that rubric for rubrics that we just discussed in the last slide, and in Pear Deck, to respond to this prompt. In what ways might the rubric for rubrics benefit individual classroom teachers? So please feel free to drop some thinking in Pear Deck. There should be a green submit a response button on the bottom right-hand corner screen. So go ahead and type some thinking there, and we will move forward from there. I am seeing a private message that chat's showing, that option is not showing up for all people, and that is something I would have some trouble to doing right here in the middle of the presentation. So I'll ask for you just to bear with me here as a substitute. Would kindly drop some thinking in chat to that question. In what ways does rubric for rubrics benefit individual classroom teachers? So you have to go back to your Zoom tab where you might have that open, whether that's on your computer or in a separate tab, and drop some thinking there, please. So we're seeing lots of contributions so far. Some of you have done them privately, so please check your audience at the bottom of the chat bar to make sure that you are communicating to the group so everyone can benefit from your thinking. We're seeing a lot of common themes. They serve as a good checklist for making sure that our communications are clear and effective. Gives us ideas of what we should be looking for. Gives us consistency in approaching the way we're planning. And again, as I see from Maryville, it gives us an opportunity to reflect on the rubrics and that we are creating. So thank you all for that feedback we're offering so far. You're exactly, and that's why we bring this forward here. It's a useful tool for calibrating and recalibrating as we have some of these conversations in our either small groups or large groups to work with. So here is the fun part, and I say fun with bated breath because we're going to try something a little bit different here. We're going to have a virtual PLC meeting where I am going to bring a few rubrics to you and ask you to use Pear Deck to evaluate them in real time. So I'll give you a moment to, I'll show you a few rubrics. I'll describe what they are and what they're to do at least. And then you'll get another Pear Deck slide that asks you to drop some responses to that rubric for rubric on the form here. And we'll hopefully allow that to open up for some conversation here in just a moment. Before we get there, I do want to pause and ask if there are any clarifying questions I can answer about I say we because it's usually an SMI, but it's just me today. I want to pause and ask if there's any clarifying questions I can answer for rubrics before we move forward. Okay. Then if more questions come up, and I'm certain they will as you start using the rubric here in just a moment, please feel free to reach out by either unmuting yourself or dropping a message into chat. So our first rubric is from an art teacher that is asking the students to engage in creating line drawings. So really simple drawings in Adobe Illustrator. So she has actually found a way to secure some licenses for her students to learn software in the distance learning, and she's leading some virtual sessions around that. But she knows she has to start some from the basics in some ways, right? Where while students know some elements of art, learning a new software to create pieces of art is a new skill in and of itself, especially in this remote setting. So the rubric here has several criterion that go down the left-hand side: use of paintbrush types, color swatches, composition design, craftsmanship, challenge, and effort. It has 4 levels of indicators here. And I'll give you just a moment to think about what's being described there. They go from at level 1 being missing or incomplete, to using 1 or 2 brush skills, to using the brush tool well, to using 5 different brush types in 3 different sizes, from using 1 color to a few colors to multiple colors on the color swatches, to looking at elements of design, creating larger elements that are obvious and larger images that are well done and creative, starting from strokes being super shaky to really being mastered and really cleanly drawn lines, and from the challenge of effort to the drawing being kind of a stick figure to something that shows a little bit more thought or creative thinking from the students, is the continuum there. So as you're reading with me here, what should be showing up on your screen now is a few dots, and a few purple dots in this case, and those dots are draggable. Those dots do not show up to anyone until you have dragged them around. I'm going to ask you to consider that rubric that you just saw and drag your purple dots to the agreed each indicator that we see here. So if you think that rubric covered the right content, you'll drag a purple dot there. If you think you disagree, drag a purple dot there. I'll give you a few moments to respond. I'm seeing dots furiously moving around the screen. So as those dots are moving around, I will go ahead, or once those dots have settled in, I will go ahead and show you some of the results here. Okay, it looks as though some of the results have shuttled down, and the reason I waited for just a moment is because if there are lots of dots moving at the same time, it really bogs down everybody's video. But this is a really telling visual description of what we've talked about and your opinions here on the rubric. So we seem to be in vast agreement that the rubric covers the right content, that the criteria are well organized, and that it fits the number of levels, fits the targets and use. Would anyone, if you would like to, this is an opportunity to unmute yourselves and talk to the reasons why you chose to agree with any of those first 3 indicators, 1A, 1B, or 1C. All right, well, I'll go ahead and call a few people out then because I can see who responded to which one. So let's talk to Matt Bowman. What are some of the reasons you chose to agree with the indicators here?
I mean, I just felt that, you know, I mean, when I think of a rubric and you look at each and every one of those things, I mean, those are things that a rubric should include. I mean, that's kind of how I went about it. I just kind of I was thinking about, okay, when I'm looking at a rubric, what should it include? And every single one of those is just absolutely, and to some pretty strong degree as well. Okay.
I certainly, those are all elements of the rubric here. What are some things that's out to you from the art rubric we just saw that said, yep, hey, that's a well-organized rubric? What made that well-organized for you?
are you asking me if like what exactly kind of, are you asking me to be more specific? Is that what you're asking? I'm sorry. I guess I'm misunderstanding the question a little bit.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's exactly what I'm asking, Matt.
Okay.
Is so
Yeah.
you agreed? What made you agree with that
Sure.
criteria we're organizing that rubric?
Okay, yeah, I'll go down the list. So obviously like covers the right content. It's like obviously you want to make sure when you're setting up any assignment, hey, what's the goal that you have in mind? So biggest thing is, hey, is it covering? Is it asking the students? Is it setting the students up to do what I want them to do, right? And
Mhm.
then criteria well organized. Anytime in education, with it's not even just with rubrics, in my opinion. I think it's with everything. It needs to be organized. So that's kind of where I fell in that one. When it comes to the number of level fits, the targets and uses, I kind of went to the agree on that one. I would say probably more or less because it's again it kind of falls again towards what, when you're looking at an assignment, what are you trying to get the students to get out of it? And again, it's like if you don't have that in place, it's all these things going all the way down this list. It's really guiding you to where am I getting the kids to understand what the purpose of this activity is.
Thank you for helping to elaborate on that. Want to
Sure.
hear from a few other folks as well. What are some reasons that we agree that rubric met some criteria? Why did we move our dots to agree on and indicate 1A, 1B, or 1C?
Hey, Randy. Chris Gale.
Hi,
Can I ask
Chris.
a question? So, just from looking at it, it looks like it's, well organized, but is it useful? It seems like an awful lot of work. I'm not an art teacher, but it looks like something way over the top as far as trying to grade something. And that's the thing, it may look great, but there's no criteria in there that says, is this usable? You know what I mean? It seems like, and again, many times I've done rubrics and I've gone and I go, oh gosh, I forgot this, or I'm gonna have to tweak that because that didn't work.
Mhm.
But I just would be interested to find out if that art teacher really found that useful.
Mm-hmm. And that is a great question. I borrowed her permission a few weeks ago and have not had a chance to circle around with her yet, but that is a great question about usefulness. And does the rubric tell us as educators and tell kids is it clear enough to tell them what we want them to know and to communicate those expectations? In this limited session, our limited time we have available where we only mark agree or disagree. The rubric does look well organized, but the usefulness is a consideration that we want to explore further. Is there anyone else who tell us why they agreed for these first three indicators before we move on to the last two indicators? Okay. Let's move down to the second two indicators. So we're looking at the second criterion of clarity, and we're looking at the second indicators. The levels are defined well, and that levels are parallel with each other. We have some disagreement about whether or not those levels were defined well. So I will go to our people who disagree first. What are some reasons that we said those levels were not defined well? So Paul Jacobs, because I can see that you responded over there. What are some reasons that you said that rubric was not defined, or the levels in that rubric were not defined very well?
I was trying to remember the rubric as best I could, and I was looking at the clarity of it. And if I can remember it that well, I felt like it wasn't that clearly defined for me to define levels at all.
Okay. And there, that makes a lot of sense, right? But a rubric should give us some insight into what we should be doing it. It should be memorable, right? So I should know that if I want this grade, I'm working toward this particular outcome. For those of us on the agree side, what are some reasons that we agree that that rubric was defined well? Lisa, it sounds like I'm calling a bunch of Bradford folks, but you're the dots that are popping up first. Lisa Bortz, what are some reasons you said that rubric was defined well? We'll get back to Lisa in a moment then. Let's take a look at another rubric and have some further discussion around that. This next rubric comes from a social studies teacher who asked their students to create a blog entry based on some select set of topics in their class. They asked them to provide some commentary on other students provide commentary on other students' blogs. And then once they have written their own set of blog entries, they've written their own commentary, and to bring the whole learning process to a close for that unit, they ask the students to write a reflective entry to really look at some of the feedback that their peers have given to them as they think about those responses. So again, it has levels of quality from, in this case, 4 to 1. That from it exceeds expectations all the way down to needs help to meet expectations. It does lay out some indicators here or some criteria on the sides. And those criterion, those levels of quality are defined by things that, by meeting the meeting minimum number of entries, meeting word, showing deep and thoughtful analysis, all the way to not meeting those areas. In the scope, in the indicator for comment, we're looking at that we've had the minimum number of comments and that we use feedback prompts to provide those comments and show exceptional constructive or critical criticism, all the way down to does not use some of the feedback prompts or does not offer some comments here. And that we have a reflective entry that that shows some careful consideration of the feedback that was given by our peers, all the way to does not meet word count or does not address some of that peer feedback that was given to us. So as we think about that rubric, again, for that social studies teacher, what is some feedback that we would give to them? For the rubric, does it appear to cover the right content? Was that rubric well, or were those criteria well organized? Does it seem to fit the number, does the number of levels seem appropriate for the case in which we're using it? Were those levels defined well? And are those levels parallel to each other? Do they talk about the same thing at each level? Give you a few moments to respond to Paradag here. I'm still seeing some dots move furiously around the screen. So once those settle down, I will try and save your internet connection here and show those in a minute. And it looks like those dots have settled down here, so we'll go ahead and show some of those responses, and hopefully it won't look so stuttery. But we see a bit more scattered opinions here about why we agreed or disagreed. Anissa, are you with us now?
I am, yes. Hi.
Okay. Welcome. I just want to say hi to you because you're here now, and people were wondering where you were. But
Hi, everybody. I'm here.
There she is. So what we'll ask you to do here in this case, for the sake of time, is you either marked agree or disagree to this on this rubric, what are some of those reasons that you might be able to put in chat? So if you agree that this rubric covered the right content, could you drop that reasoning in chat? If you disagree that the levels were defined well, would you please drop some of that reasoning in chat? And we'll follow up with that thinking in just a moment. So again, once you have your dots settled in, go ahead and drop your why in chat. Why did you agree with some of these? Why did you disagree with some of these? And we'll talk about some of that thinking here in just a moment. Okay, so we're seeing some thinking coming in that it's not as clear, that some of the top two levels are pretty similar. So we might not be able to differentiate necessarily from what's proficient to advanced. They're too close together for us to really be able to drive a meaningful distinction. And that's an important thing to bring up, because that is sometimes the toughest things we as educators have to face is, if proficient is good enough in most cases, what's better than good enough? And how do we clearly communicate that with that advanced column on our rubrics? So thank you for bringing that up. Anissa, what are some other things you're seeing some folks saying?
Well, definitely the clarity, but one of the things that somebody pointed out was just the wording was just so similar. That as a student, it would be very difficult to get, to try to figure out, am I here in this category or am I in the other category? Because it's just so similar.
Okay. So I think that in that case, the doctor was attempting to achieve that parallel of the levels, right? That the wording is similar, that it looks at a lot of the similar things. That we about example, and I will go back here to that slide in just a moment, so we're all talking about the same thing. So if we are talking, for example, about your reflective entries, one of the things they were looking for is that the reflective entry meets the word count. And so they wanted to carry some of that language back and forth. But I definitely hear that, that criticism in terms of, we want to make sure that each level looks different enough to a kid that is accessible for them. Even though that we want the indicator to be parallel, we want talking about the same thing at each level of quality. We do want it to stand out to a student to know, so they can more accurately determine and more readily determine where they are on that rubric and where that performance has landed them.
Well, and Randy, I think the other thing that came through is that, speaking of word count, you don't gain clarity always for adding more words. It's a matter of how you lay out the rubric. The other one, I believe, if I remember, was in landscape. And this one is in portrait. It's much skinnier and longer, and it almost looks, it's not as easy for the kids necessarily to read sometimes.
Welcome.
That's not necessarily a criteria, but it sure is important.
Certainly that accessibility piece is huge. If students are having trouble accessing it in the first place because of some of those aesthetic reasons, then that can certainly damage their potential to interact with that text. As near the end of our hour here together, I do want to pause here for some questions and answers. I know the chat has moved a little bit, and want to see if there's an opportunity for us to answer any questions, either about rubrics in general or about Pear Deck, the app which we've used to facilitate the conversation here today. And please feel free to unmute or drop some thinking here in the chat box. I'm also happy to hear any feedback you have about the Pear Deck experience, because this is the first time we've tried it with this particular audience.
So I liked the Pear Deck. I like how it has the piece of anonymity for the students, so we don't really know who's saying what. So if somebody doesn't make sense with what they're saying, the other students aren't going to know who that came from.
Okay, that's certainly helpful. As a heads up, and we'll get more of this on Friday, that and from the teacher point of view, you obviously can see some of those individual responses, and you know who's saying what. But the anonymity is a very helpful feature because of all those reasons you just mentioned, Nikki. What are some other questions or other feedback we might hear from our audience here? And Anissa, are you seeing anything in chat that I might have missed recently?
I'm not exactly sure, Randy, because I was actually typing while you were talking. But there's a couple of people that said that they had enjoyed it and that they think that the kids would too, especially that idea that the kids don't necessarily see each other's, that anonymity if they're a little hesitant. I was saying that Pear Deck works pretty good with both students and with adults. Like imagine if you were in your PLC meeting or a faculty meeting and used it, especially if we're having to do faculty meetings virtually for a while.
So thank you for those contributions. We do appreciate that. And this was certainly a test balloon for this particular audience of educators. So initial feedback appears to be positive. Where it makes sense to, we may find more ways to incorporate it in the future, but certainly with some tweaks. And please feel free to drop some of those tweaks or any suggestions you might have, or just good jobs you might have in our feedback survey in just a moment. That said, we do want to honor your time, so we'll march on toward our closure here. And the exit survey will be coming to you momentarily. So please look out for that. There we go. So check your emails either very shortly after the seminar concludes here today. The feedback survey will be in your inboxes. We'll use that for those of you who are first-time attendees with us, we'll use that to track your attendance. And in June, after our June 2nd session, we will email you a certificate that says you participated in this many of hours of PL. With us. So it'll give you an opportunity to prove that to whoever you need to prove that to, whether it's your State Department of Education, your administration, or whoever that might be. A part of the exit ticket does ask for or the survey rather does for an exit ticket response. And today's question is, what are some key takeaways from this discussion that will benefit you in your own rubric writing? So please take a moment to think about that as you generate some responses here. Anissa and I will stick around for any questions, comments, or other conversation you want to have here in just a moment. We thank you for your time here today and for spending the time with us. I can't believe the hour is over either. That went super fast when you have to do everything all at once. But I do appreciate the grace you showed me here as a solo facilitator. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I'll turn it over to Anissa for any parting words to offer. And I appreciate you all and the time you have spent here with us today.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I was late. I was in another meeting. Hopefully, just as always, you guys found some really good stuff to use. And don't forget, in the follow-up email, there will be a link for Friday if you don't have it already. But please, please, please make sure if you are interested in Fridays, which is an app demo, app showcase, and you want to have your voice heard in terms of the vote of which apps, then make sure that you register by midnight tonight. And that's all I got, Randy.
Thank you. like I said, we'll stick around for a little bit here. Please feel free to ask us any questions otherwise, and we will see you next time.